Well, I think as it's 7:01, I'm sure others will join us, but I think we should begin. I want to thank everyone for joining this first in the series of conversations, and I'm particularly happy and grateful that Rabbi Dr Samuel Lebens has joined us as the first person I'm having this conversation with. Really, as part of these conversations, I want to let the people talk for themselves and explain their own background. So I won't say very much. I'll just say a couple of things. I suppose I should say how I met Rabbi Lebens, and that was about 20 years ago or just more. And I was studying history in the same college and year as his older sister, Fran, and he came to visit. And I have a very powerful memory of, I think all the historians went out for a drink in the pub. And you came along because you were visiting. And I remember you being totally socially at ease with this entirely new and rather large, intimidating group of your sister's friends, which greatly impressed me. The other thing that springs to mind when I think about you is you're a Jewish philosopher, as we'll discuss, and you also interested in an area of belief and principles of faith, which hasn't had a great deal of coverage for a while, and reminds me of the story of Moritz Steinschneider, the great 19th century Jewish bibliographer, who met a young man. He said to him, "Young man, what do you do?" And he said, "I'm a Hebrew poet." And Steinschneider said, "Oh, really? When did you live?" And but we're very happy you're living now. And
thank you. Me too.
And also, you must be the most significant Jewish scholar to come out of Leicester since the 13th century. So this is also
Who was that? Who do you have in mind in the 13th century?
I'm sure there was a Tosaphist in Leicester.
Yeah, like Tosfot Chochmei Anglia. I'm not sure
exactly.
Whether they ever graced whether they ever graced Filbert Street or not.
But certainly, since then, you hold the title. So welcome and thank you.
Although Rabbi Chaim Ingram was rabbi of Leicester.
That's right, but not from Leicester.
Not from Leicester. No.
That's right. And now he's in Sydney.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned him.
Yes, like a comedian telling with local references.
That's right.
So first of all, maybe just tell us about yourself and your background and your career until this point.
Sure. So my name's Sam, as you know. And you also know I was born in Leicester. I was born into a traditional Anglo-Jewish family with traditional Anglo-Jewish levels of observance. So we would have a Friday night dinner, light the candles, make kiddush, watch television afterwards. It was always the best television on Friday night. I remember Whose Line Is It Anyway? Was a big favorite of Shabbos television watching. And then we would also drive to shul the next day and hide the car. We would hide the car about 2 blocks away from the shul, and then we'd walk the last 2 blocks. And I have a vivid memory of driving past the rabbi. It may even have been Rabbi Chaim Ingram. We drove past the rabbi on the way to shul, and my mum said, "Duck," and we'd all put our heads down a little bit so that the rabbi shouldn't see us. And I have this kind of strange idea that, or fantasy that the rabbis from Leicester must have thought that self-driving technology is a much older phenomenon than it is. Self-driving car, we've seen loads of those every Saturday. So that was the type of Judaism I was born into. At about the age of 13, around my bar mitzvah, I decided to become much more observant, which I think my family thought would be a phase. It's more than 20 years ago now. Yeah, a good deal more than 20 years ago now, and it stuck. I went to a youth movement called Jewish Youth Study Groups, which no longer exists, but that's where I got a lot of my Jewish education in the summers and the winters. We had a cheder in Leicester on Sundays, and I learned to read Hebrew, but not to understand what I was reading. And then when I finished my A levels, what do you have? You don't have, what do they have in Australia for the last two? What's the matriculation exams called in?
HSC, Higher School Certificates.
Higher School Certificate. So the A levels are the British equivalent, and actually that was those were quite important for me too. My A levels. I wasn't particularly good student at school. I got kind of average grades right throughout until the last 2 years where I really came into my own. I had fabulous teachers, and you could take 3 A levels was kind of enough to get into university, and I took 4. I was very eager to do English literature, politics, and theatre studies. But my parents said you can only take theatre studies if you take a 4th, because they didn't think theatre studies was sufficiently serious. It actually wasn't at all an easy A level. So I was shopping for a 4th A level. And the religious studies teacher at my school, Beecham College, said, Sam, you should do an A level in philosophy. And I didn't really know what philosophy was, but I did know I hadn't enjoyed religious studies at all. It was a compulsory subject at our school until the age of 16. And no one took it very seriously. The behavior was horrific in that class. So I had only negative associations with it. But he said, no, it's very different. Only a very small number of people take it. You'll love it, Sam. Lots of class discussion and whatever. So I decided I would take that A level on a trial basis. And it was by far my favorite A level. And I fell in love with philosophy, did a lot of reading at that time between the ages of 16 and 18. I used to read, Descartes and Locke and Hume in my last 2 years of school. And every time I started one of these books, my grandma Nancy would say to me, Sam, do you really understand that? And it would really annoy me. And then one time I was trying to read Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And she said, Sam, do you really understand that? And I had to admit that I really didn't understand it. It was far too hard. Anyway, that was my schooling. I decided I wanted to go to yeshiva before university, even though I was dead set on doing philosophy at university. I wanted to go to yeshiva first because I hadn't really had a very decent Jewish education. So I went to a yeshiva in Jerusalem for 2 years. My parents were very worried when I decided I was going to do a second year because they thought they'd never see me again. They thought, I was becoming ultra Orthodox. So I had to convince them that no, university was important to me, philosophy was important to me, but I just wanted to have some tools, textual tools, that I'd be able to open the Talmud and feel at home in it, that I would be able to open the classical commentaries on the Chumash, on the Bible, on the Pentateuch, and be able to feel at home with them. And actually that takes far longer than just 2 years in yeshiva, as I discovered. But that was as much as I could kind of negotiate from my parents. It actually wasn't the easiest time in yeshiva because finding the right yeshiva was difficult. I didn't want to go to an outreach yeshiva because I felt that some of them were a little bit perhaps lowbrow intellectually. Maybe that's a bit snobbish of me, but that was what I felt. So I didn't want to go to an outreach yeshiva. I wanted to go to a regular yeshiva, but I had to go to one that could cater for somebody who had very few textual skills. I could barely read Hebrew. So the yeshiva I went to offered me a lot in some respects, but was not happy with the idea that I was going to go and study philosophy at university. And it became apparent during that time, this was actually the time at which Rabbi Sacks's Dignity of Difference book, 2001, 2002, I think it was published in 2002, caused a great controversy. And my Rosh Hashiva was very vocal about being opposed to Rabbi Sacks and all that he stood for, whereas Rabbi Sacks had been a massive role model to me. as a philosopher and a rabbi, somebody I could aspire to model myself on. But anyway, that was my 2 years in yeshiva. I then went to University College London. I did philosophy. I met a young woman, Gabby, who became my wife. And I stayed in London until I had finished my PhD in philosophy, which I did at Birkbeck College. Rabbi Ben, were you at Birkbeck as a postgrad?
Right. My PhD is at Birkbeck.
So we're both doctors of the same institution. That's where I got my PhD. I wrote my PhD on the early metaphysics of Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher of probably the greatest British philosopher of the 20th century. And then, although he was born in the late 19th century. And then my wife, she's very religious, and she said, Sam, you have a PhD in philosophy. You want to have an academic career. That's all very well, but you never really reached or achieved what it was you had hoped to achieve in yeshiva that first time round. You still struggle with the Gemara. You still struggle to learn by yourself. And it's not a good example to our children for you to be an expert in one field of knowledge, but not to have any degree of parity in Torah wisdom, which should be paramount to a religious family. And she was obviously right. So we went back to yeshiva, and I spent another 4 years, two years at Yeshivat HaMivtar, which is the yeshiva of Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. And then I did 2 years at Yeshivat Har Etzion, otherwise known as the Gush, some of the last years when Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Sal, was still teaching. Since then, since I finished my time in yeshiva, my poor ever-sacrificing wife has followed me around the world. I did a postdoctorate at the University of Notre Dame, not Notre Dame. Notre Dame is in France, Notre Dame is in Indiana, and it's spelt the same. But I asked somebody when I arrived for directions to Notre Dame, and they said they didn't know what I meant. It was in America, it's Notre Dame. So I was there for a year, and then I did another 2 years of postdocing at the University of Rutgers in New Jersey. And then I finally found what we were always looking for, which is an academic appointment in Haifa, and I'm now an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa. And that's it. That's my life. Done.
Thank you very much. Now, your area is analytical philosophy.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just explain what analytical philosophy actually is.
Sure. So, I mean, philosophy itself is not so easy to define. You spend a lot of time as a philosopher thinking about what philosophy is. I'm sure psychologists don't spend quite as much time thinking about what psychology is, or historians thinking about what history is, or medics thinking about what medicine is, quite as much as philosophers dedicate to thinking about what exactly philosophy is. In fact, what philosophy is a philosophical question. There's a whole field called the philosophy of philosophy, or meta-philosophy. But philosophy means, it's a Greek word, and it means the love of wisdom. And what philosophers are trying to do is to ask the questions that no specific science could hope perhaps to answer, like what is truth, what is wisdom, what is knowledge, what is time, what is space, what is causation, what's the meaning of life, what's a good action, what's the nature of justice, these kind of very fundamental questions. And Rabbi Ben asks me, what is analytical philosophy? Well, in the late 1800s, a schism started to emerge between the philosophers. It's as a rule of thumb, it's safe to say the philosophers in English-speaking countries were one camp, and the philosophers in continental Europe were another camp. I say it's a rule of thumb because actually many of the founders of analytic philosophy were actually German speakers in Austria and Germany. But certainly after the Second World War, when analytic philosophy really took root. It's sometimes even known as Anglophone philosophy, English-speaking philosophy, because it really took root most deeply in England, Australia, America, New Zealand, Canada, etc. What was the nature of this schism? Well, in the late 1800s, there were some really important developments in mathematics. And the two most important developments in mathematics, they were related developments, were much more rigor when thinking about the nature of infinity. Infinity had been a concept that had really confused mathematicians up until that point. And in the late 19th century, there were tremendous advances in how to think more systematically and rigorously about infinity without falling into all sorts of paradoxes. And the other development, a related development, was the emergence of something called symbolic logic. Well, I say the emergence of. Medieval philosophers had done logic in a kind of symbolic way. Ancient philosophers had done logic, but like the mathematics of infinity, the mathematics of logic became much more regimented, systematic, and much better understood in the late 19th century than it had been beforehand. And a group of philosophers decided that you couldn't really hope to make progress in all of these classic philosophical questions, like what is the meaning of life, what is wisdom, what is truth, what is nature, what is whatever, without paying attention to logic, that we should take our lead from logic, because after all, logic is the science of building valid arguments. So analytical philosophy is really a branch of philosophy that takes mathematical logic very, very seriously. So it's quite a rigorous form of philosophy, whereas in the continental Europe, and this is going to be a tremendous caricature, and I hope I won't be offending any of your continental philosophers in your community, Rabbi Ben, but continental philosophy tends to be more poetic, heuristic, perhaps the thought is that you can't hope to understand these big questions, these deep questions, by very careful logical scrutiny, because logical scrutiny cuts things down into its smallest parts and looks at how they're built together. But sometimes by breaking a thing down into its smallest parts and scrutinizing each and every cog, you, so to speak, miss the forest for the trees. So continental philosophy is perhaps more holistic, and it uses more poetic and metaphorical devices to try to understand the nature of things, whereas analytical philosophy breaks things down using the quite technical machinery of the mathematician. And that's the school of philosophy to which I belong.
Although your background isn't particularly mathematical.
No, that's right. In fact, I dropped maths as soon as I could at school. I dropped mathematics, didn't take maths as an A-level, and I only started to regret that as I moved more deeply into philosophy, and I realized how useful mathematics can be. So what most philosophers do when they become serious about their philosophy, and in fact, most reputable university courses in philosophy will have compulsory components in symbolic logic, and maybe even set theory. So it's those areas of mathematics which are of most importance to the philosopher I picked up later at university. And even having said that, they're not areas of expertise, they're tools I use. But you know, I hope that people can read my work without necessarily noticing that there's kind of mathematics in the background. Sometimes I'll symbolize an argument. I'll show how the argument works in kind of mathematical symbols, but then I'll try and explain in English what it is I've just done. Yeah.
Now you've been drawn to Bertrand Russell as a subject, or his philosophy, and yet there are a few people who are less like you, I suspect, than Bertrand Russell. So a very militant atheist before Christopher Hitchens and others made that fashionable, and a person with a pretty dissolute private moral life, and also,
Yes.
and I'm making assumptions here, but I think they're sound, and an aristocrat from an extremely distinguished, high status,
Whig.
Whiggish family. None of these
Mm-hmm.
can be said to be true of you. So do you totally detach the thought from the man, as he himself said we should do, or are you quite sort of is it exciting to be in his company, even if you wouldn't want to follow his example?
Yeah, I love Bertrand Russell. He dissolute is a good way to describe his ethical standing. I think that's true. Certainly in his kind of personal life. I much prefer him to most of the new atheists. You know, if I was to choose my atheist of choice, he would come much higher than, at least, you know, I've got a soft spot for Hitchens, and for a similar reason, which is that Russell was passionate about truth. In fact, he lost his faith. He grew up in the Christian faith, and he lost his faith as a teenager. Similar time to when I was moving into greater observance, he was moving away from observance. But he always seemed to relate to his loss of faith as a personal tragedy. It's to say, he recognized there was something wonderful about believing that you are in touch with the creator of the universe, that I think he was always trying to compensate. That's not quite the right word, but his entire, you could even sketch his entire philosophical career as an attempt to replace the certainty he once had in his belief in God with other grounds for certainty. In fact, you know, he had this very important episode in his life when his brother, the second Earl Russell, he was the third, right? His brother Rowley Bertrand came home from school and wanted to teach Bertrand Russell geometry, and Russell took to it like a duck to water. Russell was a tremendous mathematician. I mean, his contributions to mathematics were almost as important as his contributions to philosophy. He wrote a book with his maths teacher, Alfred White Northhead, called Principia Mathematica between 1903 and 1910. It was released in 3 volumes. So he was a great mathematician, and his brother came home from boarding school to teach him geometry. And the first thing you do when you learn Euclidean geometry is you learn the axioms. And the axioms are things you just have to accept. They're the things you have to accept that they're true. And then you can go on to prove all sorts of wonderful things as long as you accept the axioms. And Russell just couldn't get it. Why should I accept the axioms? Prove to me the axioms are true first, which is remarkable because actually Russell went on to develop a school of mathematics called logicism, which was all about trying to prove the axioms of arithmetic and geometry. He wouldn't take anything for granted, but what he wanted was certainty, right? And there is something of the religious sensibility in a person who is searching for certainty. In the mystical tradition, we talk about unio mystica or dveikut in Judaism. We want to cleave to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? To the Holy One, blessed be He. And I think Russell deeply understood that desire. It's just he found he couldn't bring himself to believe that there was a God to cleave to, even though he desired the cleaving. I also admire the philosophical rigor. I admire the intellectual honesty of Bertrand Russell. You see, Bertrand Russell had loose morals when it came to his personal relations, okay? But he was actually remarkably principled in other regards. So first of all, he was intellectually honest to a fault. That's to say, he would always credit others with his discoveries if he thought that anybody played any small role in helping him to come those discoveries. Sometimes I think he actually overcredited people with their, and if undergraduates like Ludwig Wittgenstein came to him, as a graduate student, and he had other students, he would very often take their criticisms very, very seriously. Whereas some kind of bombastic professors, they don't care what their students, have to say, and on 2 occasions, he was willing to go to prison for his beliefs, So I actually share his conviction that, and it's easy to see with hindsight, I think, that the First World War was not a just war. And even though we can point a finger of blame at German expansionism, it wasn't necessarily a battle that Britain had to enter into. Russell, I mean, we forget this because he was alive for so much of the 20th century. He died, I think it was 1969 or 1970, having been born in 1870 or 1871. So he lived almost 100 years. He was actually too old to be conscripted to the First World War. So there was nothing personal to gain from his conscientious objection. He truly thought that this was an immoral war. And he gave a huge amount of his time to agitate against the war, ending in his incarceration in 1918 for his political activity. And I think that's tremendously principled. I would like to think that I would have been willing to do the same thing. In his later life, I think he jumped on.
I think he also lost his academic positions, didn't he?
He did. He lost. He was sent down from Cambridge for that very reason. I mean, it was reinstated. You see, many of the young fellows of his college in Trinity were off fighting, and when they came back, they were on his side. But whilst they were off to war, the majority of fellows in his college were in favour of the war, and which was rich for them because they didn't have to fight it. Yes, they sent him down from Cambridge. He lost his academic position. He was incarcerated. And then in his 80s, he went to prison again. Now, I think that a lot of the political causes he got involved in his much later life were quite naive. So he was in favour of unilateral disarmament, for example. Though he was doggedly in favour of the establishment of the State of Israel and did a lot of work actually to help Russian refuseniks, which was a cause that was close to his heart, he was equally dogged that Israel should unilaterally give back all of the territory conquered in 1967 without any kind of conditions, and unconditionally in favour of British disarmament, and was a founding member of the CND, but was certainly a very highly ranking member of the CND. Now, I don't agree with all of his positions then, but once again, he was willing to go to prison, and he did go to prison for 2 weeks in his 80s for civil disobedience around nuclear, arming. So I think that here's a person who had tremendous faults. I think they were nearly always located in his private life, although he's partly responsible, I think, for the notion of free love. I mean, he wrote a book called Marriage and Morals, and this was before the 1960s, but he was all in favor of free love. And I think those things were perhaps detrimental to the social and moral fiber of the West. So he had tremendous faults, but I also think he had tremendous virtues as well, intellectual virtues.
It's
so
interesting.
That's my love affair with Russell.
It's interesting because at school, rather, I developed a love affair with Conrad Russell, his son. So Conrad Russell was a great historian of Stuart Britain, and really about the course of the English Civil War. And I noticed he listed on his hobbies in Who's Who, uxoriousness, which is excessive love of one's wife. And I always thought that was a reaction to his father's inability, really, to be faithful and loyal to one wife.
Yes, it's interesting. One of Russell's daughters also became an evangelical Christian. One of Conrad's half sister. Yeah.
I want to actually connect to something about Russell, because you're at the University of Haifa, which has a very high proportion of and great mixture of Jewish and Arab students.
Yes.
So what's that experience like, teaching these very mixed groups as a Jew and a Zionist in the state of Israel?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great opportunity. About 25%, 20 to 25%, I think it's more like 20% of the Israeli population are Arab citizens of Israel. But at our university, it's more like 40% of the students, because we serve an area in Israel that has a higher than average population of Arab citizens of Israel. Now, philosophy is a topic that it's clearly not a vocational degree, right? So when I told my parents I wanted to study philosophy, my dad was, "Oh, great, a philosopher. You'll go to the job office and they'll be like, 'Oh, when can you start philosophy? Oh, wow. Here's your mop.'" So no, it's not a particularly vocational degree, and a lot of Arab students in the University of Haifa, a lot of our Arab students are first generation university students. Not all of them, but many of them. And as is the case, I think, often with first generation university students, there's a great cultural pressure to specialize in something vocational. So, there's a lot of our Arab students do law or computer science, physiotherapy, all sorts of things that have an obvious vocational application. And for that reason, the majority of the students who decide to major in philosophy tend to be Ashkenazi Jews, right? The most kind of economically secure demographic in Israel. Nonetheless, many of the lectures I teach in English. And there is a group of Arab students, mainly girls, young women, who have begged their parents to do a humanities because they're some of kind of the best, most bookwormy students in their schools. And the compromise they come to is they're allowed to take a degree in English literature, because functionally a degree in English literature in Israel is a vocational degree, because there is always the need for English teachers in Israeli high schools and in Israeli Arab high schools as well. So a degree in English literature, you're sorted, you'll have a job when you come out on the other side. So there's a large group of Arab women in the English literature department who don't particularly want to do literature. They're just kind of humanities type people. And they'll take as many courses as they can in history, psychology, philosophy, whatever it might be, as long as those courses are in English, because they're doing English literature and they're supposed to develop their language skills. So I actually have, I think, a more mixed demographic in my classroom than many of my colleagues who teach philosophy. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity. The philosophy classroom is one area in Israeli society where Jews, Christians, Muslims, secular people and religious people are kind of equalized. I walk in and I've got my beard and my sit dangling and my kippah on my head. And I think everyone assumes certain things about me straight away. They're certainly not expecting a philosophy professor to be religious. That's already one thing that kind of shocks them. And that tends to draw me immediately, in some respects, more close to my Arab students than my Jewish students. The majority of my Jewish students are secular, and the majority of my Arab students are theists. So if I mention my belief in God in passing, my Jewish students might be rolling their eyes, whereas my Christian and Muslim students are, yeah, that's not at all, not at all peculiar for them. And I find that the classroom is a place where I can break down certain stereotypes that people have of one another. I make a point of coupling my Arab and Jewish students to do presentations together. And I think by the end of the course, people's everybody walks around in this country judging one another. We're a very, very divided culture in many respects. And that actually creates an opportunity for surprising people. And I remember one of my Jewish students, Ophir, he said, "Sam, you're the coolest religious person I know." And I said, "Ophir, how many religious people do you know?" And he was like, he couldn't, off the top of his head, he couldn't think of a single person. So it's not that difficult to be the coolest religious person known by some of these people if they don't know anybody who's religious. So I find teaching here is a tremendous opportunity for subverting perhaps certain people's stereotypical thinking about one another, breaking down some barriers. And certainly I know, I've taught through, I taught all the way through the recent Gaza conflict. And it's those times where the division between Arab and Jewish society in Israel proper are tested the most. And there was civil unrest. There were riots in both directions in this country. I know from those sorts of situations that my Arab students don't necessarily share my politics. Nevertheless, I sincerely believe that it is only by our Arab population having a good education and finding their way securely into the middle class that we can really start to talk about kind of normalizing relations between Jews and Arabs. When we're working in the workplace as equals, when we share kind of the same sorts of responsibilities economically and socially. So I do hope that I'm making a Zionist contribution by educating both my Jewish and my Arab students.
Before we move on to talk about your work on the principles of the Jewish faith, maybe just a word about your rabbinic work, as opposed to your university philosophical work.
So I got smicha at the end of my 6th year in yeshiva, the end of my 4th year of postgraduate yeshiva. And the reason I did that, my interest has never really been in learning halacha, and smicha tends to be overwhelmingly a halachic achievement. It's to say it's the syllabus, the coursework that one has to master in order to be awarded smicha is halachic coursework. It's almost like a degree in Jewish law from the yeshiva. And law has never really been my focus, intellectually or spiritually. I went to yeshiva because I wanted to have a certain mastery of Jewish literature. I wanted to be able to understand Talmud and medieval response to medieval philosophy, medieval commentaries, and later rabbinic work. But my non-Jewish mentors in the philosophy world said, "Sam, you're going to take 4 years after your PhD, and you're not going to publish anything probably because you're going to be so busy studying. And your CV is going to have a black hole on it. And unless you say you got some sort of certificate at the end, what will you be able to tell your future employers that you did? Universities around the world won't understand this." So I had to get smicha, for the goyim, for the Gentiles. And so in my last year of yeshiva, I really buckled down and studied just halacha for the last 2 years. And I took an exam for Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg Zatzal, and got smicha that way. But my wife and I both feel that those years I spent in kollel, you're drawing a stipend, right? So you're being paid to study. And the people who have donated money to these institutions to pay students to study are making an investment in the future of Judaism. They're investing in the future leaders of the Jewish world. And therefore, we really think it's important that I don't just dedicate my life to academia, but that I try my hardest to make a contribution to the Jewish world outside of my classroom, if only to kind of pay back that investment that was placed in us in Kollel. So I try to do that in various ways. I teach at Pardes, which is a kind of non-denominational Bet Midrash in Jerusalem. I teach at Drisha in New York over the summers, which is also functionally a non-denominational Bet Midrash program over the summers. I also teach in yeshivas. I have a relationship with Eretz Tzvi, which is a yeshiva in Jerusalem, Yeshivat Oraita, which is another yeshiva in Jerusalem, and I'll go and teach there, sporadically, I don't teach in any of these places in a regular basis, but I make sure to give lectures and talks there, summer schools, winter schools, down to smaller things. Like I had a blog where I was writing a Dvar Torah on each parsha of the year, and I disseminated that to a couple of hundred people, who signed up to be part of that. To things like this, where I get to meet, members of the Jewish community more widely. I'm publishing a book with Magid, so most of my academic publications are with academic presses and in journals, and academic presses price people out of the market. My book on the principles of Judaism with Oxford University Press costs something like $100. It's ridiculously expensive, but it's for an academic market. Whereas I'm putting out a book with Magid, which should hopefully be out some point this year, and that doesn't advance my academic career. The university doesn't really care about a book with Magid because it's not an academic press. But it will cost about $20, and it will be marketed to the Jewish community much more widely. And I kind of see that as a responsibility that I have, to be in conversation with the wider Jewish community, and I'm available for weddings. that's also, I work with Sohar, and I officiate at weddings in the state of Israel.
Before we open it for questions, let's turn to your work on the principles of Judaism.
Sure.
As I said, a topic which has gone quiet for several centuries, really, apart from, at least in my understanding, a certain sort of skepticism that maybe Judaism has any principles of faith. Menachem Kellner has made quite a nice, is it Haifa?
He was at Haifa, he's retired, he's emeritus.
He made quite a career towards the end of his time as an active scholar, arguing maybe that Judaism has no principles of faith. Must a Jew believe anything? Not necessarily was his answer. And
his answer was not much.
Not much. And also people trying to make those principles as few and as elastic as possible. So what drew you towards writing upon the principles of Judaism? And maybe you could just sketch out in particular your approach to revelation.
Sure. So analytical philosophy, the movement which I explained a little bit about what it was earlier, it wasn't in its early days particularly hospitable to religious belief. And this is something you shouldn't be surprised about. This is a school of philosophy which is highly deferential to the physical sciences in particular, and to mathematics and logic. And you may have realized that a lot of physicists these days don't have all that much room for religious belief. Bertrand Russell was one of the founding figures of analytical philosophy, and he was kind of a precursor to the new atheists. So you shouldn't be surprised that analytical philosophy wasn't particularly hospitable to religious faith. And it wasn't until after yeshiva that I even sought to write any philosophy of religion. The philosophy I had written pre-yeshiva, my PhD, was all about metaphysics and the philosophy of language, and God didn't really come into it. But since the 1970s, there have been a number of very high-profile philosophers And when I say high profile, I mean within the world of philosophy. So no one else would have heard of them. But in the world of philosophy, there's been a number of very high profile philosophers who were really devout Christians. Alvin Plantinga, Robert Adams, Peter van Inwagen, Eleanor Stump, Marilyn Adams. They made their name in academic philosophy, not through their religiosity, but through all sorts of contributions they made to logic and metaphysics and epistemology. But they happened to be from Christians, and they got together and they created something called the Society for Christian Philosophers. And together, they made theism respectable again in departments of philosophy. And it's really interesting that in many areas where you'll study philosophy, you might study philosophy in English literature, you'll study structuralism or post-colonialism or Derrida deconstructionism. Most places in the university, if you hear about philosophy, you'll hear about a very anti-religious type of philosophy. But actually in philosophy departments around the world, though it's the case that theism is a minority position, it's very much one of the intellectual options on the philosophical map. A minority position, an eccentric position, but a respected position nonetheless. And that has a lot to do with the work of these Christian philosophers. And there was a small group of Jewish analytical philosophers, I mean, literally a handful, and I was included, me and Aaron Siegel, Danny Rabinovitz at Oxford, Tyron Goldschmidt, latterly Rochester University, upstate New York, who got together with some kind of elder statesmen of Jewish philosophy, Howard Wetstein, David Schatz at Yeshiva University. And we put together an association for the philosophy of Judaism. We said, we can kind of copy the Christians. Why should we be ashamed of articulating our Jewish beliefs in the language of analytical philosophy and defending their coherence and their cogency? And this book that I wrote, The Principles of Judaism, was kind of the first book-length fruit of that type of labor. And I suppose what I wanted to do, because it was like an opening salvo in this kind of this movement this nascent movement that we're part of, I want to say, okay, so I'm not going to try and prove in this book that Judaism is true. Anyway, that wouldn't be a very Jewish thing to do. We're not into kind of proselytizing as a religion. But what I would like to say is, okay, what are the key principles that are non-negotiable? What are the things that if you're going to make sense of a life of Jewish observance, you have to believe these things. If you don't believe these things, then nothing else can work. And as you mentioned, that was I call it, I call it Jewish axiomatics. Right, so Christian theology has this thing called systematics, where they try and give out a systematic theology. But if you look at the great Jewish philosophers of the medieval period, they were much more interested in laying down what the axioms were. So you have Maimonides and the 13 Principles of Faith. You have Rav Albo, Sefer HaIkarim, which literally means the Book of Principles, right? You have Rav Chasdai Preskes in Or Hashem. He also lays down what he takes to be the fundamental principles of Judaism. Sefer Amanah of the Abarbanel. There seems to be a tradition of Jewish thought of saying, look, we're going to lay out our stool. What does that mean, laying out our stool? I'm going to tell you what are the principles that are non-negotiable. And we can debate about what those principles are. And I think there is a virtue, though I disagree with Menachem Kellner, who almost pushes the number down to 0. I think there is a virtue in having as small a number as possible of non-negotiable principles, because the fewer non-negotiable principles you have, the more robust your theology can be. Right, the harder it is to prove you wrong. Right, so I follow what I take to be the medieval consensus, the consensus that emerged, which is that the principles round down to 3. You see this also in Franz Rosenzweig, right, in The Star of Redemption. in terms of modern Jewish philosophy. Oh, do you still see me? Yeah. The three are, in essence, that there is a God who created the world. That God reveals his will to us through Torah, and that God plays a pivotal role in steering history towards the eschaton, right, towards Yemot HaMashiach. Now, all three of those principles, creation, revelation, and redemption, need to be fleshed out. And what I tried to do in the book was to say, well, what are the most plausible ways of believing in these three things, right? So in the first part of the book, I look at contemporary cosmology, right? The study of the universe, the physics of the universe. What's the most plausible way of believing that the universe we see around us today is the result of the creative activity of a divine being? That's the first part of the book. And I come to some quite radical conclusions in that part of the book. And I say, look, the conclusions I come to, you don't have to believe. There are other ways of believing that God created the world other than the way that I flesh it out. But this is the way that makes most sense to me. That's part one of the book. Part two of the book is, what does it mean to believe that the Torah that we have in our hands today is the product of revelation? And I try to flesh that out, and I flesh that out in my own way. Once again, I say there may be other ways to do this, but this is the way I'm going to do it. And in the final part of the book, I look at what it might mean to believe that a good, knowledgeable, and powerful God is actually in control of the course of history. That's a very difficult thing to believe, because if we look at the things we've gone through as a people and look at the things we've gone through as a world, it's very hard to believe sometimes that a good God is somehow in control of what's happening. So this gets us into the problem of evil. And the third part of the book looks at that carefully and also tries to articulate what is the Jewish hope for the Messiah, at least minimally. And I don't think it's plausible to dedicate. I don't think it's intellectually honest or plausible to dedicate your life to stringent observance of Jewish law if you don't believe at least some fleshing out of all three of these things, that there is a God who created the universe, that this Jewish law that we're observing is somehow the product of revelation of God's will, and that God's, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, and there is evidence to the contrary, but despite all of the evidence to the contrary, a good, powerful, knowledgeable God is steering history towards a desired endpoint. And that's what the book's all about.
That's fascinating. I think I'll open it up to questions in the last 5 minutes we have. So I think we're going to be fairly liberal and hope for the best. If anyone has a question, I think Ezra is going to enable people to unmute, but only unmute if you have a question. Unmute and then give it to Rabbi Lebens, and I'm sure he'll answer very nicely. So if someone has a question, please just unmute and announce it. I'll give another couple of moments, and then I'll fill the gap. Well, maybe while people are thinking, I'll ask one more question, which is, what do you make of the argument that sets of beliefs are a foreign graft onto Judaism, and that the entire enterprise of looking for principles is foreign and inappropriate, which is one of the arguments made by the sort of principle school? Yeah.
So it depends why you're looking for these principles, right? Some religions, and specifically multiple churches within the umbrella of the Christian faith, have book-length catechisms. These are like lists of very kind of specific beliefs. And if you don't believe in one of them, you're out, right? You don't belong. You can't be a member of our church unless you believe in this, a whole book-length thing. And we don't tend to act like that in the Jewish world. And I think it's good that we don't act that way in the Jewish world. The way that Menachem Kellner reads the Mishnah, Masechet Sanhedrin, it's the only Mishnah that kind of sets out what the compulsory beliefs are, right? the Mishnah says, these Jews don't have a share in the world to come. He who says that the Torah isn't from heaven, and he who says that resurrection of the dead isn't from heaven, and an apikoros. Now, an apikoros could just mean an apostate, right? But interestingly, the Gemara over there gives a very reductive meaning of what apikoros means in this context. According to the Gemara over there, Masechet Sanhedrin 99b, I think it is, it says, what the Mishnah means by an apikoros is somebody who disrespects the rabbis. Okay, says Menachem Kellner, well, look at this Mishnah. If you say that the Torah is not from heaven, it's not what you think, it's if you say. If you say that there's no resurrection from the dead, not what you think, and if you disrespect the rabbis. Now, Torah not being from the heaven and the resurrection of the dead not being part of the Torah, those were the rallying cries of the Sadducees at this time, right? An opposing sect to the rabbis. So what Menachem Kellner says is that what the rabbis were worried about was sectarianism, was behaving in ways, not what you think, but behaving in ways that would lead to sectarianism. And I'm relatively sympathetic to that reading of the Mishnah. You know, if you're a good Jew, you keep all the mitzvahs you can, and you try to keep kosher, and you try to keep Shabbos, and you try to keep all of the other laws of the Torah, but you struggle with belief. Who am I to stand in judgment of you? We all struggle from time to time with belief, right? We're allowed to have our dark nights of the soul. We're allowed to have our struggles with faith. Judaism doesn't legislate belief in quite the way that some other religions do. I'm down with that. But I'm a philosopher at the end of the day. And what I want to ask is, fine, okay, but what would you need to believe in order to make sense of these practices? I'm not asking that question in order to legislate. I'm not asking that question in order to say, oh, you're not kosher if you don't agree with me. But I'm a philosopher. And the thing is, I think sometimes we Jewish thinkers, theologians, we are philosophically on the back foot. We're embarrassed to say we have reason to believe God exists. And here are those reasons. I'll give you an argument, right? We have reasons to believe that Sinai happened, right? That there really was a revelation to the assembled masses of the Jewish people at Sinai. And I'll give you those arguments. Okay, if you end up not believing, but you're still keeping Shabbos, Yofi, that's very nice, right? we're not going to burn anyone at the stake, right? Which is what catechisms were written to do. They were written to justify burning people at the stake, right? That's not what I'm interested in. But there are things that we believe, and we have good reason to believe them, and we shouldn't be afraid to articulate those things, to offer arguments for those things. That's what my Christian analytic philosopher colleagues are not ashamed to be doing. So we should be doing the same thing for our congregants, and that, you know, that's what I'm interested in doing. Not to take a position on this question that you rightly raise, as to, you know, what role do kind of axioms of faith play halachically. I'm not so interested. I just think they're true, and I'm going to argue for their truth.
I said I'd open it up, and I see that computer marked Janet Newstein has a question, so we'll let the gentleman under the name of Janet have the last word.
I doubt this gentleman's really called Janet.
And then we'll close.
Yes, I've got to issue a internet warning at this stage, Rabbi Ben and Rabbi Sam, and that is the Janet Newstein right next to me is your mother's first cousin, Sam.
Not first cousin.
I see. I knew there's a Newstein in Australia.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So I issue that, and all the stories about the self-driving car and stuff will be checked out with your mum.
Yeah. It's all true. Although I must say now that I know that reports should go home, I didn't finish that story, which is that Elon
Musk copied it.
Yeah, you do hear cases, and I knew cases of young boys or girls going to yeshiva or seminary and feeling quite alienated from the family that they've kind of left behind in observance. My parents, although they will tell you they were really worried about my staying a second year, they did not want that to happen at all. They were nothing but encouraging of my growing in observance. It came to the stage I didn't even ask them, but they gutted their kitchen and recashed it under the auspices of the Chabad rabbi in Leicester, because they never wanted there to be a question about whether I would feel comfortable eating in their home. Now, truth be told, I would have bent every rule I could have done to be lenient in the case of eating in your own parents' home, because of the halachic responsibility children have to render respect to their parents. But I didn't even have to ask. They gutted the kitchen and made it kosher. In fact, in Chabad halacha, most poskim rule, most halachic authorities rule that a glass doesn't need to be either milky or meaty. It's neutral and it stays neutral, whatever you do to it. But Chabad treat glass as either milky or meaty. So my parents have a frummer kitchen than I do. When I come home and I put the glass down in the wrong sink, my mom's, oh no, what are you doing? I sometimes feel like I have to go through a sheep dip to get into my own kitchen at home, home to be kosher enough for my parents. And also, they would no longer drive to shul.
I was going to say that. We've walked with them several times.
That's right. They now walk to shul. They don't have to hide the car because they don't drive at all. So it's been a wonderful thing to be part of that process with them, of growing in observance.
Now, I actually had a serious question.
Yeah.
And that question is on the third principle, whether or not there is an end point. Maybe the end point is just a good Jewish life in continuity, and there is actually no specific end point. Good. Especially when one looks at things like the age of the earth and the universe at large, and what we should be is an age of perfection, not necessarily an end point.
Good. So exactly how to relate to the eschaton, the end of days, is a can of worms. And it's obviously a large question. And there is a really large range of thinking about this in Jewish thought. The Rambam follows the Gemara that says, Ein bein olam hazeh and olam haba. There's no difference between this world and the next. And I take it in context to mean there's no difference between this stage of history and the messianic stage, other than shibud malchiot, which is that we will no longer be subjugated as a people to the rule of oppressive regimes, right? So one look at the Messianic age is not this time of open miracles, but it's a time of great political stability, a type of political stability perhaps we've never seen, global peace, right? If that's all we're looking forward to, then that's still quite wonderful, right?
Yeah.
We're not there yet. That might be enough. Right, I certainly agree with you. In the book, in the third part of the book, I lay out what Maimonides takes to be the minimal requirements for a Messiah. We believe there will be a king Messiah. What does that look like? Well, for some people, it's this very, very miraculous turn of events. To the Rambam, it looks very much like the institution of a constitutional monarchy in a time of global peace, the end of hunger, the end of poverty, the end of preventable disease. We're a long way from that time, but it doesn't necessarily require open miracles. But do I think open miracles are possible? I do. I do believe open miracles are possible. I believe they've happened in the past, and I see no reason to deny that they might happen in the future, but I leave that up to God to decide how it will happen. And you're absolutely right. The end of days doesn't have to necessarily be a specific point in time. It could be an epoch, but I have reason to believe we are not yet there. There are some thinkers, I'm not one of them, but there are some thinkers who have believed that the Messianic age is something more like a regulative ideal. Isaiah Leibovich used to say, Maimonides' principle of faith is the Messiah will come, and we will always believe that the Messiah will come. Future tense. As soon as you believe that the Messiah has come, you've already kind of transgressed one of Maimonides' principles of belief. We never believe the Messiah has come. We constantly believe he will come. Now, like I said, I'm not one of those thinkers. Maybe I'm more naive than that. I really do believe there will come a time in which preventable diseases will be prevented, in which there will be universal standards of living, a threshold below which nobody will have to suffer. I think those things are achievable goals, and I think that Judaism has a role to play in articulating that vision and making that vision a reality. The Jewish people and Jewish law itself have a role to play in articulating that vision and making that vision a reality. But, like I said, I'm not for burning anybody at the stake. If for you, the Messianic era is just a regulative ideal, something we aim towards but never achieve, as long as we're always shooting for the stars, maybe we can achieve something less grand than the stars, but something worth achieving anyway. If that's your belief, like I said, I'm not going to be burning anyone at the stake. So yes, Messianism can take many forms. But if you don't believe that history has a purpose, if you don't believe that the Jewish people have been called upon to play an integral role in bringing that purpose about, then I think Judaism starts to lose a lot of its meaning. And that's why I think the third principle still needs to be there as one of the essentials. We can debate the details, but in principle, history has a purpose and the Jewish people have a calling. And that's part of the package of Messianism.
On that, I think very inspiring and uplifting note, it's almost 10 past the hour, so I don't take any more time away from your other work, Rabbi
Thank you very
Lebens.
much.
And thank you so much. It's been really fascinating and enjoyable, and really heartening to see the sort of work that's going on, that you're doing, that exists in the world, in the Jewish world, and please God, you'll continue to thrive and to flourish, you and your family, in the work you're doing.
Rabbi Elton, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks both rabbis.
Learn about your life. Unbelievable.